welcome back to another episode of Card Talk, a podcast where we spend a little bit of time talking to new players about the game that we love. I'm your host, Dave Walsh.
And I'm Ted Bannock, and I love teaching new players about this card game. I absolutely love it, David.
I know, Ted, you do. It's a lot of fun, and we would probably be remiss if if we were a podcast in the community that's been around for a while and we didn't address this opportunity as new players join and they need resources to learn how to play. So before we get into today's episode, I just wanted to remind people that this is our February extravaganza month, where we kind of put our normal content on hold and talk about just separate things in the game. We've done couples in the game. We did, superlatives last year. And so this year we're doing New Player February, focused around new players joining the game. Not that veteran players can't get little nuggets of information out of this, but it's specifically designed for new players to hear what we have to say about what's going on. And normally we would read down through our list of patrons, but in this extravaganza month, what I'm going to ask is, if you are listening to this, to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also comment on the shows. If you listen to this in an audio podcast, subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. So as new players are looking up for podcasts in the game, this resource becomes available to them as those ratings.
Feed the algorithms.
Yes, it's all about the algorithms, right? And so you can check out the blog. The blog is available over at cardtalk2018.com. And there you'll find all sorts of reviews on player cards, which follows kind of our normal what am I looking?
It's
format,
like
our normal
format,
right?
It
follows
like
our normal format.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this show, if you're new to the game, Card Talk is all about reviewing cards from the Lord of the Rings LCG, the card game. And so we're gonna have, if you're curious about certain cards or you want ideas for decks, that's generally what we talk about. But as David said, we want to tackle a special segment for new players, or special series. And if you are new to the game, first of all, welcome. And hopefully this will help you if you're learning about the different phases of the game, because at some point in time, everyone's going to take this out of the box and experience it the first time. And not everybody has the benefit of learning from somebody else. And there's a lot of people who just happened upon the game and cracked open the rule book by themselves, and it's very easy to make some mistakes. I made plenty when I first did that. So we want to help guide people down the right path.
Yep, and we also want to make sure that you have reliable resources, right? And so that's what we are as a experienced LOTR LCG players. Lastly, before we get into this episode about setup and starting your game, consider supporting us on Patreon. That's the best way that you can tell us how much you appreciate what we're doing for the community. Every year we get out swag to people, so you can be a part of that. Over there, you just go to patreon.com/cardtalk2018. So, Ted, this episode is kind of... this isn't the first episode of New Player February, but this will be the episode that everybody okay, what is this going to be all about? So what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so we're going to have a series of episodes going through the phases of the game, and this is going to be sort of I'm going to call it like phase 0, I think, is maybe a term I've even heard thrown around the community before, because you have 7 phases to the game, but before the game, you have to actually take it out of the box, set it up physically, and then you have to, once you've decided the scenario that you're going to be playing, you have to follow up the normal player setup for yourself and everyone joining you, and the setup of the particular scenario as well. And our goal in this episode is just to sort of walk through those steps so you can just get an idea of how long it takes, what to expect, and things you can and can't do, things you should be aware of.
Yeah. And so here you are, you've taken your game out of the box, and and hopefully you understand a little bit about card games. That makes it a little bit easier, whether you're coming to us from, Magic the Gathering or Pokemon or some other, card game that's out there, maybe Arkham Horror, that's a little easier to get grasp Lord of the Rings rules. And so, you have some card sense, I guess is the best way to put it. So as you start to get ready for your first game, and you've already considered building a deck, or you've looked up building a deck online, we're ready to set it up. So as you get going, what you're going to want to do is you have kind of three different types of cards. You're going to have the encounter cards, which have the Eye of Sauron on the back. You have your player cards, which have the One Ring and a fancy flourish on the back. And then you're going to have double-sided quest cards. So what you're going to do, the first stage of the game, in this step 0 of the game, is to shuffle the encounter deck and your player decks. And so if you're playing multiplayer, everybody's going to shuffle their decks. That shouldn't be too crazy, right? And I don't think that there's anything special about that. You just have to make sure you create the encounter deck correctly. And there's little symbols on the quest cards that show you how to create the encounter deck. It's made in the rule book. It tells you which encounter sets to make the encounter deck from. And make sure you grab the correct quest cards for the encounter that you are going to play, for the scenario you're going to play. Take the quest cards.
Probably make a reference to, I think we'll be giving some examples, and I think for this one, the example we're going to use, we'll just use Passage Through Mirkwood, which is the first scenario out of the core set.
Yeah. And so you take the quest cards and you put them off the side. We'll worry about those a little bit later, but you shuffle your decks. And then within your decks, for step 2, you put your heroes on the board, whatever kind of deck that you have chosen to build. Again, you can use the decks that are given to you. That's not recommended after the first couple of times. The best thing to do is kind of either build your own deck with a combination of different player cards, different heroes, or to net deck a deck using the player cards. Rings DB is a great resource for that. But you take your heroes that you're using and you put them on the board, and you set the threat level as per the threat cost of each hero. And so you add that up, and that's your starting threat. And
so your threat cost, just a reminder, is the sort of the highest value on the card, like physically and numerically, it's going to be the highest. So it's the blue number on the upper left-hand corner of the hero.
Right. And that kind of represents how much of a threat to Sauron you are. The higher that number starts, kind of like to talk about what that means in the game, the higher that number is to start, the more likely it is that you are going to be noticed by Sauron, have to engage enemies, have to do things that the encounter deck is going to do. So there's a whole section of the meta of the game to figure out what a good starting threat is. And so I feel like that you will figure that out as you go along. But we'll talk about that. We are going to do a deck building episode or 2 later on, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But definitely you set your threat level on the threat counter. You'll have a counter that'll come up. Okay, and then the third step, and the other thing is keep in mind there's nothing going on here. You're not actually able to do anything like game-wise. You're just setting up at this point. And so
you're just taking stuff out of the box and laying it on the table, basically. There will be some steps where you have some influence, or can't think of the exact word, but you'll be able to
make some choices.
Modify, make some choices. Yeah. And we'll be reading off an example here for you, sort of as we get to the end, as it becomes relevant.
Right. Okay. So then you have to so the third step of this setup is to make tokens out. Get your token. I almost said tokens. Get your Tolkien out, and you read the books.
Out, get your copies of The Hobbit out, right. and Fellowship. Get those out. Have them on display.
Right. And so you'll have 3 tokens. You'll have progress, resource, and damage tokens. They go out. I like to put them in little cups just to keep them separated. Some people just put them in a pile. Some people have aftermarket, swag tokens that they have. There's all sorts of things you can do, but you want to set those up and have them ready to go.
Yep. Some players, you feel free to use dice too if you want.
Yep.
As long as you know that there are 3 separate tokens: damage, resources, and progress. Whatever way you want to keep track of those is fine. I really like the design of the standard tokens that come out of the box, but over time they might not hold up.
Right.
But players substitute them with all kinds of.
Yeah, they're nice thick cardboard though. They're not necessarily cheap.
Yeah, mine have.
But
mine have lasted, but just they show marks of love.
Yeah, right. Especially if you have kids or animals that like them. Sometimes they'll come up missing and show up a couple days later. Anyways, the next thing you do, this is kind of the first time you have a real decision point, is you get to choose who's going to be the first player in the game. Now, a lot of times, and so the way that is done is, Ted and I will give you an example of how this is done. Hey, Ted, do you want to be first player or should I be?
David, I would love to be first player.
Okay, Ted, you are first player.
If you don't mind.
Right, I don't mind at all. Okay, so that was a perfect example. Somebody chooses to be first player. There is some advantage to being first player sometimes. So, you want to make sure. I mean, it's not always, necessarily an advantage. I don't think that there's necessarily a disadvantage to being second, third, or fourth player, but the first player gets to do some things first in the planning phase that can maybe impact other people. If your deck isn't set up to impact other people, then I don't know if it matters if you're first, second, third player.
Yep, and keep in mind the first player changes every single round. It just continues to rotate, and it doesn't make a huge impact player-wise. It will throughout the game, the way the rules work, but it's going to change anyway. So it's nothing really strong here. And keep in mind also another tip, if you are playing solo, if you're only playing this by yourself, you are always the first player every single turn.
Right. Yep. And so then after this, again, another decision point is you get to draw your starting hand. This is new player tip I can tell you is that you're used to, if you're playing solo, you get to draw 6 cards, and then in the first resource phase, you also then get to draw 7 cards. So you kind of start the game with 7 cards in your hand. But I was in a habit of drawing 7 cards and just starting the game. But that's technically incorrect, and it's yeah. So just draw 6 cards. And see if there's cards that you are able to play, see if you're really able to do that. If not, you're allowed to take 1 mulligan, which means you discard your cards, you shuffle them back into your player deck, and then you draw another 6 cards.
Yep.
And so is there, times when, drawing all 7 cards matter? Yes, but, I think that it's more important that it's about setting up the habit of drawing 6 cards in the drawing your hand phase, as opposed to, all 7 of your cards.
Yep, and so you can do that by the rules. You can do the redraw or mulligan 1 time, and it's a full complete redraw of 6 cards. You cannot select or set aside certain cards. You don't discard cards. You just shuffle all 6 back in and draw 6 brand new ones, and you can do that 1 time unless you choose to.
Right.
I guess forfeit and start over.
Yeah, I mean, I guess technically, if you haven't gotten to that point, you're like, oh, I lose, and now I'm going to start the game again, and then draw another 6. If you're playing solo, that's an option that you have. That's I guess, but and maybe this is a good time to just briefly talk about some cards that you may want in your opening hand. So, if you're playing the core set, I think. So there's 3 of each card in your hand. So if you're playing leadership, I would say that cards that you want to have in your hand may be, Steward of Gondor, Sneak Attack and Gandalf. Those are good things to see in your hand right from the very beginning. If you're playing Spirit, a Test of Will is always great to see in your opening hand, along with Unexpected Courage. If you're playing Lore, I think that maybe, depending on the scenario, maybe a Force Snare is always good to see at the beginning.
Yeah, Secret Paths and Radagast Cunning are also events that can be handy in a pinch of the core set.
And then Tactics, you have that ever popular Feint, which is good all the time. So those are kind of with the exception of those lore cards. I think that a lot of these cards are staple cards. Staple meaning cards that you will always think are really good and go into a lot of decks almost throughout the whole card pool. So those are cards that I like to see in opening hands if I'm building decks with them, and I think that that's true for the core set. Folks.
Yeah, make sure it's a good. Generally, you want to. It depends on the deck you're playing. For most standard normal decks, whether you're playing the starter decks that are monosphere or you've built your own deck that could be 2 or possibly 3 spheres, you generally want a good mix of cards. You don't want all attachments, all events. Most decks are pretty well rounded and have a balance of those, and you kind of want your opening hand to reflect that, because they all have their own advantages during the game.
And the other thing that I would suggest is if you have duplicates of cards, to really consider whether you want to keep those duplicates. So if they're powerful cards, then maybe you do, but if they are duplicates of cards that aren't necessarily very good, or you could play one and not the others, you may want to think about mulliganing and getting a new starting hand.
Yeah.
Okay, now step 6. There's only one more step after this, but step 6 is placing the quest cards. So another and last deck that you will have, I call it in quotes, is because you'll have 3 or 4 cards that describe what you're trying to do in the scenario with its goals and objectives. And have directions on them. So you take that quest deck and you set it up in numerical order with the A side up. And so you'll have quest card 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many cards, and you'll put that in a stack. Do not shuffle that, and keep them A side up. And in an art sense, the A side is sepia or brown tones, and then the B side is the full color art of that same scene. So you want the brown tone or sepia side up on all the cards in number order, starting with A, 1A, and then you go down through there.
Your passage through Mirkwood, as the example that we're going to be using, has a total of 4 quest cards. It's got a 1A side, and then there's a 1B, of course. There's a second quest card, 2A, 2B, and then there are 2 3As that each have a different side 3B, and the 3As are going to look identical when you're first looking at them, but the backs of them are different, and as you play through the scenario, the scenario rules will determine which one you go to, essentially.
Yep.
So that'll be a fun little playthrough, kind of mixes it up and gives it some extra replay value, and scenarios have multiple versions of the same numerical quest stage. So your whole deck, 4 cards for that setup.
Right. And so that's why I put deck in quotes, because 4 cards doesn't seem like a deck, but I guess that's what it is. And so the final part of setup is going to be performing scenario setup instructions, where you have the setup keywords on the actual quest deck, which will give you specific instructions about what you need to do for the quest. And so typically you'll start with 1A, you'll read, there's usually some flavor text, and then you'll read what the setup is, and then you'll immediately, as soon as that's complete, flip it over to 1B. And then there may even be further setup instructions, and then you'll start the game proper. If there are player cards that have a setup keyword on it, maybe boons and burdens for campaign mode, during that you're getting in this release, then those setup also happen here after you set up the scenario. So I always think of it like the encounter deck always has the advantage, so they get to set up everything first before you can do anything in terms of setting up and playing. At this point, you don't have any resources because it's not the resource phase yet. You haven't gotten to the game proper. But Ted, do you want to talk about Eleanor?
Yeah, yep. So to continue along with our example, so if you're setting up Passage Through Mirkwood, 1A is Flies and Spiders. You place down the quest deck with 1A side up. It has some flavor text on there, which has no impact on the game other than just
put you in the mood. Yeah, put you in the mood. Yeah.
Yeah. So the setup, so to search the encounter deck for one copy of Forest Spider, which is an enemy, and one copy of Old Forest Road, which is location. You add them to the staging area, and then you shuffle the encounter deck afterwards. So those two cards will start in the staging area. They will start in play for when your first turn begins. And the setup will vary by scenario. So when you follow along to the next scenario, it's going to be different than this. You're in a different location, different objectives, different cards, and the setup is different to reflect that. So at this point in the game, as Dave mentioned, you only have the 6 cards in your hand, and you have no resources yet because the game hasn't started. But your heroes are in play. Your hands are in play. The game is sort of live during the setup, even though you haven't had your first turn yet even. So sometimes the setup cards may target you as a player. They may target your characters in play. And because your characters are in play, they are able to use their abilities if they are some type of response. So the example of the core set is there's a spirit hero, Eleanor. She has the response that when a treachery card is revealed from the encounter deck, you can exhaust her, cancel the effects of that treachery, discard it, and replace it with another card. So in this example, the 2 cards that the deck goes and gets are not treachery cards. So it doesn't apply to this particular example. But during future games, during your next game, if the setup instructions tell you to reveal a card and you reveal a treachery and it's during the setup phase, Eleanor is in the game even though she has no resources. So you can use her ability at that point in time.
So you can use responses that apply that don't cost anything at this point in the game. And Eleanor is a great example because her response does not cost anything. And so, yeah, so I mean, those are the 7 steps of setup. And there's some ticky-tacky things as you get deeper into the game that happen here, but if you're a new player, I think that this is, pretty straightforward in terms of doing this. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention is like how much physical space you're going to need. And so, here's the thing. This game, I think, if you have a standard gaming playmat, is just a little bit bigger than that standard game mat if you're playing solo to be comfortable. I think, as you start, building, putting your decks out, you start revealing cards from the encounter deck, you're going to need a lot of space. And so I have found that you need just, maybe a space that's, like 3 feet by 3 feet, 3 feet by 2 feet, it's got to be just a little bit bigger than kind of a standard size gaming mat. It's just to make it comfortable so cards aren't overlapping and you're turning cards to the side and, because you're exhausting them and readying them. So, there's a lot of that going on. And, yes, you can play it in a condensed area, but I think you'll want to play in a much, probably have a little more space than not enough space. So, yeah. Ted, what's your experience?
It's like any board game, right? A lot of players dedicate space to the, if it's a main hobby of theirs, but not everyone has that luxury, and so they got to sort of carve out a space on the kitchen table, just big enough to play. And as Dave said, yeah, if you got a little bit more than a standard playmat, that'll cover you. But yeah, cards are going to get tossed around, and you sort of got dice and tokens flying in places when you're keeping track of things, depending on if you're using either one of those. So yeah, but it's important just to
tie back your hair. Make sure you don't have loose clothing, because when you take your real loose sleeves and all of a sudden your cards and your tokens go everywhere, it's like, oh no. This is the game that mainly caused me to have to shave my head to this, is because I was sick and tired of my long flowing locks getting in the way of my gameplay.
Yeah,
so it was either the game or the hair, so I picked the hair.
You made your choice.
I did.
Noted. Priorities.
Yeah,
life's about priorities.
Yeah, of course. Yes. So, anyways, Ted, do you have any last gasps about what we've talked about here?
Yeah, I think we covered the core things. So just make sure you go through these steps in each order, and as the game develops, you may get setup cards too that come into play. Some of the boons and burdens will tell you to set up or be permanent, and those things always come as the last step after you get all these things in play. Just another reminder, even though your heroes are also live and in play, and they can use responses, a response is different than an action. So you have a core set hero Barivore who lets you draw 2 cards. You can't use that anywhere during the setup phase. So if you're thinking you could draw your 6 cards and then maybe Barivore to draw 8 cards and then decide if you want to mulligan 8 cards, unfortunately you can't do that. But once your first turn actually begins, you can begin using her when your turn starts.
Yeah. So I think
that's it. I think
that's pretty much it.
Wraps it up. So hopefully it keeps it clear
right.
for new players, and come back to reference this in case you have any questions.
Yep. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to make comments below in the YouTube channel, or send us an email, or whatever it is that you need, and we'll try to clarify. There's also, Facebook group, Reddit channel. There's all sorts of subreddit. Let me make sure that I use the proper terminology, where you can ask questions, and all those questions from new players are always welcome. We are the most inclusive and welcoming community out there. So, continue to ask questions, or start to ask questions if you have them, and we'll help you out, because we were all there once.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. Okay, well, that closes out this episode, and we'll see you in a couple of days. Talk about more phases of the game. Have a great day, everybody. Do you love the content? Here's what you can do to stay connected. Become a patron. The money collected through Patreon goes into keeping the lights on here at the podcast. We love our patrons, and you can join at many different levels. Visit patreon.com/cardtalk2018. You can subscribe to us, whether you're watching our YouTube channel or you're listening to us in your favorite podcatcher. Hit the subscribe button to get notifications of all our new episodes. Didn't know we were an audio podcast? Find us by searching Card Talk to get access to our 120 plus regular episodes. Didn't know we were a video channel? Find us by searching Card Talk LOTR LCG on YouTube, and there you can find not only our regular episodes, but you can find our bonus playthroughs and other content related to the game. Want to get a hold of Ted, Grant, or myself? Feel free to email the podcast at cardtalk2018@gmail.com.